Hi, everybody. Today is Friday, March 21st, 2025, and our friend Professor Ted Postol is back with us. Welcome back, Professor.
Nice to be back. G- Glad you could have me, even from Berlin.
Yeah, my pleasure. Ted, let's get started with what we learned from the news. Here is the Telegraph saying that one Trident submarine could incinerate 40 Russian cities. Why Putin should fear Britain's nuclear arsenal? And I know that you're in Berlin right now. You want to talk about nuclear bombs, the use of nuclear weapons, and the way that Europeans are behaving toward the conflict in Ukraine. What's your take on what's going on in the European countries in general?
Well, I think there is some kind of mass hysteria going on, to be honest with you. Um, I'm in Germany now, and I'm in Berlin, and I've already had some conversations with friends here, and it seems that the general population, which is normally not focused on these kinds of security issues, is now being told and is aware that there is some kind of big security threat to Europe. And the particular people that I've been talking to are not especially interested in these kinds of things normally, which is understandable since most people are just trying to live their lives. And but they are now aware of it, and there's a lot of concern. And in particular, in Germany, there was a mass. There was a vote uh, in the parliament, and uh, the vote was to raise the debt limitations in government spending and to prepare for the possibility of big investments in military enterprise, and basically to begin a serious, very expensive program in building armaments. And the argument for this is the United States is pulling out of Europe, and the Russians are presenting this gigantic military threat, which Western Europe can no longer cannot deal with without the Americans. All of this is untrue, incidentally. It's just manufactured, and and the German economy is needs to be reconfigured to be able to manufacture, to rearm in a significant way, so that they can deal with this uh, terrible, relentless threat from the east, basically. I've already been told in a private discussion by an individual who has conversations with senior people in the French military, that there's a lot of concern in the French military about this, because the feeling there is, among the people that this person talks to, is that this is also, a strange and unjustified action. And the French and the Germans, of course, have traditional issues with regard to military buildups in each country. So who knows what that means? At this point, I would say it doesn't mean much, because we don't yet know how things are playing out. But it's certainly uh, uh, a problematic situation. We know that the new Merz, this new leader in Germany, he's quite honestly, he appears reckless in his statements about the military needs. I'll be meeting people later in the week, so I'll get a better feel for, what people who are in the political establishment think, since I'll be meeting some people from the parliament. But it's also clear that Macron has tried to turn France into some kind of nuclear bulwark against Russia. And of course, the article you just showed about Great Britain, UK, is it would be silly if it weren't so serious because what there's one Russian submarine could destroy all of UK, all of UK, one Russian submarine launch. Because what is this article supposed to be saying? Is it supposed to be saying we can destroy Russia? Well, that's not new. That's not news. And the problem we're dealing with now is how do we set up a, a political, politically stable situation so nobody is talking in these reckless ways, making these implied threats. This is not a minor uh, problem. I mean, we could be talking about the end of human civilization as we know it if things get out of hand. And right now, certainly the political leadership in Europe uh, looks like they're out of control. They're just yelling and screaming and making threats. The Russians are so far pretty sober about what they're trying to do with the Americans. The Americans are pretty sober. This Trump initiative to normalize relations with Russia would be a good thing for everybody. And the ultimate outcome that would benefit Europe most, and I'm talking about Europe now, not just the United States, is if the United States and Russia relations, normalize relations not only militarily, but also in terms of commercial activities, then the best possible outcome for Europe could occur. And the best possible outcome for Europe right now would be to reopen the Nord Stream pipeline, start getting access to inexpensive oil and gas, and save Europe from this downward spiral economically that's now going on. Germany here has had a gross domestic product that's negative in the last year because of the tremendous increase in gas and oil and energy prices. Germany has a highly industrial economy. It's deindustrializing now. It has no choice because the energy is no longer there to do these advanced industrial activities. Why would the leadership of Germany be against this? I don't understand this. I mean, one of the highest priorities should be is to put Germany back on an economically sound track. If you look at the economic expenditures of the German government, about half of the expenditures are based involve social programs. This means the money is coming from somewhere, and it's got to be the social programs. So the average German needs to understand that all of these wonderful things that Germans have available with the help and aid of their government are going to start disappearing in a big way. And the money is going to be going to building weapons that the best one could hope for is that they won't be used. So, and there's no need to use them because there's no threat. It's really uh, a, a chaotically delusional situation at the leadership level in Europe. And I've I'm not an expert on the politics of Europe. I claim no expertise, but I have friends who are, and they have made statements to me in the past about the European, criticisms on their part about European leadership being infantilized by the American domination of the political process in Europe through NATO. And I've never quite understood what these friends of mine were talking about, but if this is what they're talking about, it makes sense. These people are simply infants. They're childish, and childish is the right terminology. It's like a child having a tantrum over something that has no meaning. That's what we're looking at right now. and at least as far as I can see. So I'm a little isolated. I've been traveling, so I haven't had a chance to meet the body politic at the upper levels, but I will be seeing people as of Monday, and I'll have a better sense of what's going on at least the parliamentary level.
Yeah. What are you going to present? Here is your presentation that you've sent me to open it up for everybody to see what you want to talk about in terms of the way that, as you mentioned, the German government is trying to manage the situation.
Well, if you just show the title slide, we can start there. And um, basically, this is really, I call it a technical explanation of possible consequences of U.S. missile deployments to Germany, because what I'm simply going to do is describe what could happen. By what could happen, I mean the United States and the German government have reached some kind of agreement where the United States will be deploying missiles on German territory in 2026, assuming this very bad idea is not canceled. And it seems to me that the complete absence of understanding at the political level, at the political leadership level in Germany as well as the United States, is it can be the only explanation for this extremely dangerous and ill-considered idea to deploy these missiles to Germany. Now the big problem is, as I'll show, we have a history. We have a history of what happened the last time we did this. And the history is that there was a large number of nuclear weapons, both deployed by the Western Europeans and the Soviets, the Soviet Union at the time. We're talking about the 1980s, and there was a near accident that led to the use of nuclear weapons by the Soviets because they thought that there was a sneak attack being prepared by the Western Alliance. Now, I'm actually not going to talk about this war scare, which is an important subject. It's called the Able Archer war game, but what I'm going to talk about is the war game itself, because what the war game did is it showed the natural consequence of all these weapons being in close proximity to each other. Could we just have the next slide, please? Basically, there are certain facts about nuclear weapons that your audience needs to understand. I'll call them technical facts. These are not political. These are facts of physics, of the nature of these weapons. If you use these weapons, there are three basic phenomena which in combination makes them extraordinarily lethal. So these weapons are extraordinarily lethal. I'll go through this in more detail, so I won't dwell on this. But the three factors are: one, it's called the thermal flash from the nuclear fireball, which is the light and heat from the fireball. I'll explain that shortly. So that is by far, overwhelmingly, the most lethal and damaging immediate effect of a nuclear detonation. Most people think it's the blast wave from the detonation. Notice I put that number 3. Number 3 is the blast wave. Number 2 is the fallout, radioactive fallout in the target areas and downwind of the detonations. So these are points the audience I'll be expanding on later in the discussion. If we go to the next slide, we get into a more complicated set of concerns about the nature of nuclear weapons. the primary issue with nuclear weapons is that their capabilities are so vast, so great, so large that they dictate how each side must use them in order to deal with with a confrontation should it begin. So it's like being put into a box with a wild animal. Once you're in the box with the wild animal, you have no choice. You must take certain actions. And so one way to think of this is that the nature of the nuclear weapons themselves, once you're in a situation where you're beginning to use them against each other, dictate what you have to do. And one of the things that they dictate is that the enemy's nuclear weapons are so powerful that you need to destroy them as quickly as you possibly can. This is true for both sides. So both sides need to take actions with their nuclear forces to quickly destroy the other side's nuclear forces as soon as possible before those nuclear weapons can be used against them. So this drives the situation to a very high level of escalation immediately. So there's been a lot of talk about escalation control in nuclear warfare, but there's no such thing, because the characteristics of the nuclear weapons being so capable as an offensive weapon force the adversary, no matter how rational they are. Each adversary can be totally rational, but they're caught in a box with this animal, and they have no choice but to go at the animal, even though they would prefer not to escalate the confrontation with the animal. That's the way the situation is. It's a characteristic of the nuclear weapons, and that's what is really the message that should come out of this particular discussion as I expand on it. Let's go to the next slide, please. So basically, this just summarizes the points I just made, that you have to deal with the fact that the other side has such strike capability. You must react against it. And the next slide, I think, is a little repetitive. Oh, it's just so. Let's just. This is experience from a war game that occurred in 1983, known as Able Archer. Now, the war game was involved the top level leadership of the. It was a Western war game. It involved the Secretary of Defense at the time. That would have been Caspar Weinberger. It involved the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time. Communication lines in Europe were being used just to do as realistic a simulation of a war experience for everybody in the game. The soldiers on the Western side. Obviously, there were no soldiers on the Eastern side because it's a war game, but there's a team constructed in the war game that's supposed to be the Soviet team, the Russian team today, but the Soviet team then. And then there's a group of experts who kind of referee the game. So one side makes a decision. The group of experts decide whether it works. Maybe you launch a nuclear weapon, maybe it fails, or you launch a nuclear weapon, maybe it succeeds, or maybe a command center is destroyed. So if you're in the war game and it's your command center, you can no longer use it. If it's in the war game and it's the enemy command center, they can no longer use it. So this is as realistic a game for the Western participants as possible. So let's look at days 1 and 2 of this war game. In day 1, there's nothing happening. Notice at the bottom of this map, I have a little pinkish circle for what's called a tactical nuclear weapon. To the right of that is a theater nuclear weapon, which is about 100 kiloton weapon. 75 kilotons and 100 kilotons are basically the same yield. That's a red circle with a red dot with a circle around it. And then the strategic warheads, which are in the 1 megaton range, a little larger, a little smaller. Those are multiple circles together. So if we go to the next slide, we see the first day of the war. In the first day of the war, it's postulated. So the Americans and European allies playing the game are told that East Germany is, of course, a hostile power at that time. Incidentally, I'm now in East Germany in East Berlin. But at that time, it was a separate country. It was the GDR. And the war breaks out. And the German forces, well, the Soviet forces, German among them, are advancing. And it's postulated that the Soviet Warsaw Pact forces are gaining ground, and this is the situation that the Western individuals are presented with. Incidentally, there is very good reason to believe that the conventional military capability of the Warsaw Pact was tremendously overstated at this time during the war game. They were given much more credit than should go back to the slide before that. So what happens is on the first day, the Warsaw Pact is doing very well, and the NATO cannot hold them back. So they use about 10 or 11 tactical nuclear warheads. These are typically fired with artillery pieces, but they can also be dropped from airplanes. And these are aimed at causing a pause in the advancement of the Warsaw Pact forces. In the next slide, we see what happens on day two. On day two, what happens is you have almost 100 nuclear weapons. These are tactical. So these are small nuclear weapons. Average yield is probably around 10 kilotons. They're smaller, they're bigger weapons, but an average yield of about 10 kilotons are used. So this is basically 24 or 48 hours into the conflict. So let's just take a look at what one of these tactical nuclear weapons mean. Let's go to the next slide. Let's just look at the effects of these low yield warheads, which are delivered with artillery shells or bombs. This is just the initial fireball. Remember, initially I said there's a fireball created, and it's because the nuclear weapon releases so much energy when it's detonated, it creates a volume of air within which the air is heated to an enormously high temperature, and the air expands violently outward. So in this case, we're seeing it's a 20 kiloton nuclear weapon. It's basically a 10 kiloton weapon for our purposes. The scale it varies slowly with yield. And so this 10 kiloton fireball has expanded in about 6 thousandths of a second to well over maybe 150 meters in diameter. So it appears to be small. Its interior temperature is 80,000 degrees Kelvin. Surface of the sun is 6,000 degrees, so it's very hot. The reason it's so hot is initially when the nuclear weapon detonated, it was at about 120 million degrees Kelvin. So 6 thousandths of a second earlier, there was a nuclear weapon at the center of this fireball. Can you see a cursor or not? There's no cursor. You can't see it. It's too bad. Anyway, so if you look at the center of the fireball, that's where the weapon would have been detonated. And so it started out at 120, 140 million degrees Kelvin, cooled very rapidly, and now it looks like 80. It's the interior temperature is 80,000 degrees. If we go to the next slide, we see the same slide, but what I'm emphasizing in this slide is that there's an enormous amount of light and heat radiating from this fireball. The actual effective temperature of the fireball is about 50,000 degrees Celsius. That's about, so it's 7 or 8 times hotter. Every unit area of this fireball is 7 or 8 times hotter than the surface of the corona of the sun. Keep in mind that the sun's 150 million kilometers away, and the ground around this detonation is only a few kilometers away, or fractions of a kilometer. So if we go to the next slide, we see a very long time later, tens of times, 5/100ths of a second later, the temperature of the fireball is expanded tremendously in size, and it's cooled to only 4,000 degrees Celsius. So it's about it's radiating about 20% of the surface area of the fireball is radiating about 20% of the equivalent surface area of the sun's corona. So it's still, very hot, and it actually its temperature will change as it expands. It'll actually get hotter. If we go to the next slide, we just see the evolution of the fireball in the 3 times I showed. 6,000ths of a second, you see in the center there, the bright fireball. 5/100ths of a center as it expands further. And then you see the cloud, debris cloud. The photograph shows about 9 seconds later. And above, and pictured over the debris cloud is just sort of a rough volume of hot, buoyant, rising air that's radioactive. It contains all the radioactive debris that's been produced from the initial explosion. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to give you a sense of scale here. This is like a typical sky with clouds in it. If you look toward the lower part of the altitude range, 2 to 4 kilometers, these are mostly rain clouds. The clouds at above 3 kilometers are too cold. They're ice clouds. So the clouds at roughly 3 kilometers and below, nimbostratus and stratus and cumulus clouds, when you look up in the sky on a cloudy day, those are the clouds you see, the bottom of those clouds. The other clouds you rarely see, especially on a rainy day, because the lower rain clouds are typically much more numerous. In the next slide, I show you what the 10 kiloton debris cloud looks like when it stabilizes. This is a tactical nuclear weapon. This is a small weapon. On day 2, you already see that hundreds of these weapons have already been used in Germany. Let me also remind you that 80 to 90% of the radioactivity released from the detonation of the nuclear weapon is now in the mushroom crown of this fireball. So 1 hour after this explosion, the radioactivity in this cloud is about 100 times larger than the radioactivity released in the Chernobyl accident from 1986. 100 times larger. It decays very rapidly. So within 1 day, it's only twice the radioactivity of the Chernobyl release. But it's a lot of radioactivity, and only a small part of that has to fall to the ground immediately below the detonation point for there to be a tremendous radioactive hazard on the ground. So we go to the next slide, we begin to see some of the effects summarized here. This is Hamburg, It's a satellite photograph of Hamburg in 2025. And the next slide shows the area that was destroyed in 1943 by really was 6 days of fire attacks that killed of order 40,000 people. Initially, it was thought hundreds of thousands of people died because the damage was so extensive and it was so hard to find people that it was only later, after a large amount of work, that it was realized only 40,000 people died. These areas were totally burnt out, and there were firestorms generated by the fires from these conventional attacks. The attacks were designed to burn the city down. So these were incendiary attacks. These were designed not to blow the city apart, but to cause a big mass fire that has dynamics of its own. Just to get a sense of what a 10 kiloton weapon would set on fire, we go to the next slide. And we see that's just one 10 kiloton artillery shell. And the next slide shows what two would do. And keep in mind that on day two, at least 100 10 kiloton weapons were used, but things are not yet really going. So remember, this is an escalating situation. So if we go on to the next day, I'm sorry, let me show you the effect of the firestorm. And this is, a photograph of the fires burning. The next slide shows part of a firestorm from the outside. In the next slide, we see what is going on. You have this area on the ground that is burning. It's a very large area. It's square kilometers. In the case of a strategic nuclear weapon, which we'll talk about later, you could have 400 square kilometers of city on fire simultaneously. So what happens? Everything's on fire at this low level of altitude. Everything, flames are rising to 300, 500 meters in altitude. So flames are really hot because there's upward air motion. There's no place for the flames to go in this large area but upward. They're buoyantly rising. As the air buoyantly rises, it pushes the air, the cooler, more dense area, upward and to the side as the buoyant air rises. And so we see what happens in the next slide is it sets up an airflow. And that airflow, notice it's sort of like mushroom shaped. And notice that the winds tend to be driven upward into a circular motion back down to the ground and into the fire zone. So you have very high winds on the ground, which are generated by the fire. If you have you have a cozy winter evening in your home and you have fire burning in your fireplace, you'll feel the cool air from the room immediately adjacent to the fire being sucked into the fire, into the chimney area. That's what's happening here, but on a vast scale. And the scale is so vast and its intensity is so great that the wind speeds in the fire zone are 150 or more kilometers per hour. So the hurricane force winds. And the air temperature is above the boiling point of water, well above the boiling point of water. So what does this look like on the ground? Show you the next thing. This is an experiment. This is actually it's a demonstration of the airflow phenomena that I described to you. In this particular case, there are a bunch of candles that were put on a surface put in close proximity. The candles were lit at the rim, not everywhere. So this is not as bad as what would happen. The fires would be everywhere from the nuclear explosion. But in this case, the fires at the rim, if you look at number 2, all start burning inward, because what happens is in the center of the fire, if you focus on the rim, um, air is sucked in from outside the rim, but you can't suck in air from inside the rim because there are other parts of the rim sucking at the air. So you have a net flow inward, and when you look, by the time you get to time 3, you have this very, very intense mass fire growing. This is on a small scale. This is on a few feet, a few foot scale. But the scale for a nuclear weapon will be kilometers, tens of kilometers, or more. So if we again look at the next slide, this is what happens to people in shelters. The intensity of the fire is so great that it heats the brick above the ground and near the surface to such a high temperature that below ground shelters they're turned into ovens. And this is what was happening. So you couldn't get into these shelters for days after the firestorm in Hamburg. This is from Hamburg. So once shelters were opened, actually these corpses would turn into ash because there was no oxygen in the shelters. And once the oxygen from the outside would come in, they would sort of slowly combust and just disintegrate into ash. And in fact, one of the ways they tried to measure the number of occupants in a given shelter was to measure the weight of the ash that they were able to collect. So it's pretty. If you look at the next slide, this is what happens to somebody on the street who tries to escape. This person decided quite correctly that staying in a shelter was not a good choice, and they attempted to run in the street to get somewhere. Of course, they couldn't have known where. When they got out of the streets were full of smoke, so they could hardly see. Firebrands were in the air, pieces of wood that were burning or material burning, being carried by the wind, which was hurricane force. And this person just succumbed to the environment very quickly. You can see that they were probably trying to get up at some point, but of course they just died on the spot. And their clothes were burnt off them simply because the winds were so hot. They caused the clothing to just burn off. We have another image of this kind. It's a better photo, but it's equally horrifying. This is probably a woman who was running with her child and trying to escape. So if you left the shelter, you were incinerated, and if you stayed in the shelter, you were incinerated. So the situation, you can see, there's enormous amounts of debris, and the debris is actually from the fire. So if we look at the next slide, you can see this is a fire in London, a mass fire started by a German incendiary raid. And what happened is once the buildings burnt out, the internal structure that was holding bricks together and the building structure together no longer was able to hold the structure together, and the structure starts collapsing. And of course, all these bricks fall into the streets and they fill the streets with debris. Incidentally, this is how the World Trade Center collapsed. In the World Trade Center was constructed so there were internal beams that were attached to the outer walls. And the internal beams kept the outer walls from buckling, so they would all stay vertical. When internal beams melted or lost strength from the fire, the walls buckled, and then you had the whole structure buckled. And so it's a similar phenomenon. If we go to the next slide, we can see how serious the environment was. This, if you look at these collections, you can see, if you look hard, you can see evidence of 3 vehicles on the street. We know from the report this photograph was taken from that these were fire trucks. And the fire trucks had to be abandoned by the fire crews because they were at the edge of the firestorm. So these crews actually were able to get out. So you're seeing, of course, the debris many hours after the fire kept burning. And what happened in this is the fires, the streets were filled with embers, burning embers, and the streets were getting hot. And the firemen decided correctly that there was nothing they could do, and they tried to move out of the firestorm area, which is forward of us. And these people report that these strong, fit firefighters, some of them had to get down on their stomachs and knees next to the curb of the street and pull themselves along because the winds were so high that they couldn't stand up and move out of the fire. So this is so this area is much more dead than you would look at it. I mean, it's not completely flat, but it for all intensive purposes, it is no different from just a pile of rubble standing there. And we can see some evidence for how high the rubble got by looking at the next slide, which is an area of the city that was. You can see these the people. There was clearing of the rubble, but you can see how high the rubble was piled in some areas from the collapse of buildings. All right, so these are the tactical nuclear weapons. Why don't we go to the next day? So we've only looked at day 2. Let's go back to day 3. All right, day 3. Several hundreds of tactical nuclear weapons have been used. These are the plume, the pink dense circles. But you'll notice that there's a whole bunch of theater nuclear weapons that are used. These are the red dots with one circle around them. These weapons are being used on bridges and tactical formations to try to stop the enemy from advancing. Notice that in East Germany, there's a whole bunch of tactical weapons. In West Germany, there are fewer tactical nuclear weapons used, but there are more strategic nuclear weapons used. And the reason the more strategic weapons used is the Soviets are trying to destroy the logistics centers in West Germany where equipment is being moved to the front. And those strategic centers being attacked are designated by the point with 3 concentric circles in red around it. So we see that there are a whole bunch of strategic attacks. This is only day 3. We have hundreds of tactical, of theater, of tacticals, looking at 50 or 60 or theater, 100 kiloton weapons, and already 10 or 20 strategic weapons. If we go to the next slide, we see the effects. I'm going to describe the effects of the higher yield nuclear weapons. We'll again go back to the fire produced by the 10 kiloton weapon, just to put it on a scale. This is Hamburg again. And the next slide shows you what happens if there's a theater nuclear weapon used. There may be many tactical and theater nuclear weapons used. And the last slide shows a strategic weapon. Well, it turns out the whole area is covered, so I have to go to a smaller map in the next slide. And this is the area that will be destroyed. Everything would be destroyed by this 1 megaton strategic weapon. Let me point out that the day 3 slide showed that there were a dozen to a score of these weapons used by both sides on day 3. So already there's almost no cities left in Germany. So let's go on and see what happens in day 4. Uh, let me just go on. We'll worry about that later. Let's go back to day 4. All right, here's day 4. Notice that there have not been a lot of strategic nuclear weapons added, but there have been some, particularly in Poland, where several Polish cities have been hit, particularly in the northeast sector of Poland, where Gdansk is, and there's a big seaport there, and logistics would be coming in for the war there. But in West Germany, more cities have been hit. In particular, you can if you compare the day 3 and day 4, and things are generally looking very bad. Notice there's a line. If you focus on the strategic nuclear attacks in the northeast corner of Poland, you see a line of tactical nuclear weapons extending below. Those are bridges that are being attacked with tactical nuclear, 100 kiloton nuclear weapons, because you need a lot of explosive power on a big bridge to bring it down. So in 1983, they didn't have the accuracy they do today, so they could use lower yield nuclear weapons, but they have more of them, so whatever. So anyway, this was the situation on day 4. Let's go to day 5 of the attack. Now things are really going. So within 5 days, you see tremendous number of strategic and tactical nuclear damage. Everything in this whole area is radioactive, as I'll show you. There's radioactivity everywhere. The second most lethal consequence of the use of nuclear weapons. But I'll describe that shortly. So if we go, the next slide here, it just summarizes Paris, London, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Brussels are destroyed. Every major German, Polish, and German city. Sweden, Belarus, Baltics have been hit. Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Singapore, Hawaii, and Alaska, just at this point. There's nothing left to fight for. So what happens next is the strategic exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States, leading to both countries being destroyed. 5 days, an exercise. This is what might have happened if the Russians had not somehow learned that this was an exercise, because they were watching the exercise. They couldn't tell all the details, but they thought that something was happening and the West was preparing for an attack. And the Soviets were preparing to attack Germany. So this exercise that we saw being played out might have actually occurred, leading to a general escalation to general war. So let's look at the radioactivity associated with these detonations. Of course, we have this nuclear cloud. It's filled with radioactive debris. The radioactive debris is just sucked on into the rising buoyant air from the fireball. And in the next slide, we see it evolved a little further. Here we have it in perspective, because we're going to show you what these different debris clouds look like for different yields next to clouds. Notice that I've had to compress the diagram of the clouds to a much smaller level. The leftmost cloud is the 10 kiloton tactical nuclear weapons. The middle cloud is the 100 kiloton nuclear weapons. And the cloud to the right are the larger 800 kiloton, 1 megaton nuclear weapons. The exact yields are really irrelevant. Notice that The radioactivity in the 100 kiloton cloud uh, within inside the 100 kiloton cloud is about 1,000 times more radioactivity than that of the Chernobyl release for the 100 kiloton weapon. For the 1 megaton weapon, which is 10 times larger, it's about 10,000 times larger than the Chernobyl release. Now, an hour is a short time, so most of this radioactivity in the cloud will not reach the ground. A large amount of it will reach the ground in hours, but not in the first hour. But in the first hour, a lot of, a small fraction of this is going to reach the ground immediately below in the area that's been attacked, which means that the radiation levels are going to be enormous. Everybody in these areas will die from radiation exposure uh, within an hour or two. I mean, the radiation levels will be tremendously high. So, of course, the cloud drifts downwind. If we look at the next slide, let's go further. One more. I'm sorry, I can't. I've been putting this thing together in real time. Um, let's go one more slide. This is go back one. This is the nuclear debris cloud. Actually, go back two. You're going forward. Okay, that's it. What you see here in this diagram is a diagram that shows you the distribution of radioactivity in the radioactive cloud as it stabilizes. And a large amount of this radioactivity trapped in the mushroom in the cap of the debris cloud is going to fall to the ground within an hour. Notice, though, that in this particular diagram, I show a secondary column of black smoke being sucked up from the buoyant rising cloud from the initial explosion. If you look at the next slide, we see first the stabilizing cloud. This is Hiroshima. At the bottom, if you look to the bottom right, I've labeled smoke cloud from combusting objects on the ground. So this cloud is still rising. It's about 7 or 8 minutes into the attack. It's not fully stabilized. And the smoke you're going to see rising is the initial smoke created from the flash of the fireball, the initial combustion. This fire is going to burn for 3 hours intensely and will not burn out for 6 hours. The next slide we see is again just a few minutes after what was shown, and you can see the smoke is being pulled up by the buoyantly rising air from the fireball. So this has nothing to do with the buoyantly rising air from the mass fire that's going to be developing in the next tens of minutes and hours. So if we move ahead 3 or 4 slides, just let me just go ahead further. What happens if go back 1 slide? If you go back 1 slide, what happens is this is a 100 kiloton weapon. What's really goes on is the debris cloud filled with radioactivity starts dropping material to the ground. So you have material dropping to the ground immediately over the detonation point, but then the wind carries the cloud downwind, and of course, radioactive material is falling to the ground. So if you look at the 1 day after the cloud has, the right cloud depicted in the cartoon, the radioactivity that was in this cloud initially has decayed to about 20 times the radioactivity that was released at Chernobyl. All right. Now, this is 1 day, so 24 hours. So Typical average wind speed would be maybe 15 kilometers per hour. This means that this cloud has now been moved downwind from just the weather to maybe 350 kilometers downrange, all the way dropping radioactivity on the ground. So let's take a look at what could happen. You go to the next two slides. Let me just go further. I won't. So this is just a cartoon. You can't separate this thing out. All I'm attempting to show here is give you a small sense of how all of Germany, essentially all of Poland, because this debris cloud that's over Germany is going to pass over Poland. And the radioactivity in it is going to be a lot lower than it was over Germany, but it's going to be very high and essentially lethal. So Northern Europe would be turned into a radioactive wasteland in addition to being filled with fires. And incidentally, there would be fires burning in all of the areas where cities or urban areas or small towns had been hit. There would be forests burning in areas where there was forested areas where there was significant amounts of vegetation on the ground. And the air would be filled with black smoke. So it wouldn't be fog that would impair your vision. It would be black smoke. You would not be able to, you wouldn't know where you were because the smoke will get mixed from all, the ambient winds will cause the smoke to mix. So you will not be able to know where you are. There will be no visibility because all this black soot will fill the sky. The radioactivity on the ground will be lethal. Fires will be burning in some cases for many tens of hours or even days. This is Armageddon. I don't know how else. I don't have words to describe what this could be. So this is basically the consequence of the attacks. Notice I have not yet talked about blast damage. I've only talked about fire and radiation. If we go to the next slide, let's go flip through the next two slides. Next slide. Next slide after that. This is a man, go back one slide. This is a man dying of radiation sickness. And you can see he's bleeding into his skin. He's got spots on his skin because the effects of radiation cause the blood to lose its ability to clot. And so you become like a hemophiliac. And people who die of, if you get a lethal but not, if you get a lethal dose of radiation, like what the population of Poland might be exposed to this level of radiation. So large parts of the population will be dying in the next days to weeks. In Germany, they would be dying in the next hours. So, but the radiation exposures will be lower in Poland. And so you'll see victims of radiation exposure. First, people will start feeling sick. They may start feeling better for a few days, depending on their exposure level and their health. Then they'll start feeling sick again, and they'll start bleeding into the skin, and they will eventually die of massive internal hemorrhaging and infection from the effects of radiation poisoning. This is what the Polish population would look like. Okay, so let's move to the blast, and I'll end there, just give you a sense of blast. But let me underscore, this is the least dangerous consequence. So we have this fireball. It produces a shock wave because it expands so violently. And the shock wave, because the fireball is so vast in size, the shock wave is very thick. So the next slide just sort of depicts the thickness of the fireball. I'm sorry, this shouldn't be. We'll go one more slide. I'm sorry. All right. Well, I showed the wrong slide, but let's step back here. Here it is. You got that slide. Go to the slide you just showed. 1-4. Here it is. All right. You can see in this case, the shock wave is very large in dimensions. It's thousands of feet in dimensions, which means that it takes seconds to pass over an object that's subjected to shock. So not only is a structure hit from the front by the shock wave, it's enveloped in the shock wave and tends to be crushed. We'll see this effect if we go to the next slide. We'll go through the sequence of events now. What you're seeing here is the initial light from the fireball. The light has not yet gotten as bright as it will get. So this is the early stages of the development of the fireball. You're just seeing the luminous early light from the fireball. The light is going to get much more intense. We see that in the next slide. See the paint from the front of the house is burning off. In this particular case, if you had to build a normal building, curtains would burst into flames. Rugs in the building would burst into flames. Interior upholstery and sofas and things. So the interior would be set on fire into a vigorous fire. But what you see next is the fireball is no longer so bright. And there's a shock wave that's coming from the fireball, but it's going to take a couple of seconds to arrive. So in the next slide, we see the arrival of that shock wave. Now notice that the front wall of the building is caving in. And you can see a line across the roof which is the forward edge of the shock wave. And you can see the tiles on the roof have been stripped off and blown forward by the movement of the shock wave, by the air motion accompanying the shock wave. In the next slide, you see the building is completely enveloped in this shock wave. And in the next slide yet, you see more of the consequences of envelopment. Notice that the roof looks like it's been caved in, like a giant mallet has hit it from the top center because of the crushing effects. And then the building completely disintegrates by the combined effect of the blast pressure and the winds. You see that in the slide here, and I think there's a further slide showing you. And then what you see at the end, one more slide, is this structure here. Now, the right question to ask immediately is, why hasn't this burnt down? And the answer is, this structure was designed for a test of the explosive blast wave. So it was covered with asbestos. It had no material inside it. Walls were not painted. There was no furniture to light up. Everything was set up to keep this structure from catching fire. So it was just, but if it were in the city environment that we know it would normally be, you would see nothing but ash at this location, nothing but soot and ash. Or if it were a brick building, piles of bricks. So this is the consequence of the war game in 1983, and what could have occurred if the Soviets had not been informed of the fact that the West was not planning a nuclear attack, and the Soviets had actually preemptively launched nuclear weapons at the West, and the West would have then responded in this escalating chain of reactions, leading to the destruction of civilization as we know it. We wouldn't be here today talking about it because there would be wouldn't be many people left to write history. So why am I talking about this? Well, by introducing nuclear armed missiles onto German soil in 2026, we are recreating the situation that we had in 1983. This situation was solved by the adoption of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1986, which in fact was partially a result of the shock that American decision makers received from experiencing the Able Archer exercise and from the very far far-seeing reactions of Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan when they finally started talking to each other. Ronald Reagan was stunned. He writes about this in his autobiography. He was stunned to find out that the Russians were afraid that we would attack them. He hadn't imagined it, you know. When I was in the Pentagon, people would always talk about the Russian attack, on the Soviet attack, and I would, since I'm a naturally obnoxious person, I would always sit there in the briefing and I'd say, "What are you talking about? What about our first strike on them? What do you think? You don't think they're worried about that?" And people would always be a little shocked, and I'd say this because I was in an environment where everybody had classified access that I had. I said, "Look at the war planning that we are involved in. This is a first strike plan." People didn't like to acknowledge that. I think that the credibility of my colleagues in the Pentagon, I had a small group of colleagues where I would bring this up repeatedly. To the credibility, they didn't get angry at me. They listened to what I was saying and they took it in, because I was trying to make the point that the Russians are looking at us. You're looking at them, and you're really scared, and you should be. But don't forget that they are looking at us, and the same thing could happen on the other side. So people who are doing this are really worried about the other side. Right? Nobody could imagine that we would attack first. The Russians actually did imagine that, but they were really planning. Their planning was no different from ours. In our case, the planning was no different. There was a lot of preemption planning, but people told themselves that we would never preempt. But if you looked at the planning and the numbers and how forces were going to be used, there was no question we were planning a preemption. So this is what we escaped from, fortunately. So we're going to start this over again in Europe by putting these nuclear weapons in Germany? Does Germany want to be a flashpoint for the nuclear war that will end modern civilization? It's the craziest thing you can ever imagine. So I ask the German public to just look at what I have shown here and think about it. It's your decision. You're the German public. You're the ones who can decide whether or not you will accept U.S. nuclear weapons on your soil. And it's also something I would ask Americans to think about. Do we want to create a flashpoint in Europe for an accident that could lead to would almost certainly lead to a rapid escalation to a global nuclear destruction? It's just crazy. It's just there's no point. There's no military utility in putting these weapons there. If we the allies need to strike Russia or its allies, we can do it without ever putting weapons into Germany. There is no need to create this flashpoint to just make people more nervous. There's no need for it. So I think it's just a bad idea, a very bad idea, and it should be avoided. I think with the strongest energy, and I believe the Trump negotiators already understand this. I think that if the negotiations go forward successfully between Russia and the United States, I think there's a good chance the United States will cancel this very ill advised deployment, which came from the Biden people who created all the problem with who started the Ukrainian war basically by their aggressive actions. And now Ukraine is left holding the bag. The Trump administration is trying to clean up the mess. So this is not something we want to have happen. We don't want this deployment.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Postol, for being with us today and
I hope
teaching
I've
on.
ruined your day.
Thank you so much. And great pleasure as always, Ted. And see you soon in the
Pleasure.
United States.
Pleasure talking. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.